Good day to you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Film Focus, episode 210, the review for 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen of the North, South, East and West, and welcome to another episode of Film Focus. I'm your host, the Hypersonic55, and I'm glad that you decided to join me once again for some film-related discussion. And today, as stated at the top, we're going to be talking about 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, as my first official review of 2026. Now, considering how good this film is, there was no way I wasn't going to talk about it on the podcast. Unfortunately, it just took me a few extra days to get around to it. At the time of recording, the film had released at least just over a week ago here in the UK, so I really wanted to try and get my thoughts out during the opening weekend, but as per usual, life things happened and it just ended up being pushed along a few days. But The Bone Temple, man, I have a fair amount to say about it, but I want to try and keep it concise. But before we get into the review, I just want to talk about 28 Years Later from 2025. Now, the lead up to 28 Years Later was pretty hype for me. I liked the marketing. I was very intrigued. There were so many questions, and I feel like the film, for the most part, was positively received, though there was a fair amount of mixed to negative responses depending on what certain people were expecting to get out of it. I know when it comes to the appearance or lack of appearance of certain characters, the filming techniques involved and the ending, especially that ending, ended up really rubbing people the wrong way. For me, I enjoyed the film quite a bit. I like seeing how this universe had evolved from the previous two films and seeing how humanity, at least in the areas of the UK that were shown, have adapted and found a way to, I wouldn't say prosper exactly, but at least exist in a way where they can still be safe and still have a relatively normal existence as long as they followed certain rules, knew when and when not to go back to the mainland, and knew how to hunt and take on the infected, aka zombies. But seeing the main characters involved with Spike, the little boy, his dad and his mum, and seeing the dynamic essentially with his dad, with his mum, seeing how that whole element progressed, seeing how they navigate the infected when they're in the mainland, and then coming across Dr. Kelson and his whole thing, it was very fascinating. The film was a lot more slow-paced, but a lot more human. It really dived into the emotional dynamics between the main characters, and I found that stuff fascinating. I know for some people, I think they were hoping for something a little bit more roaring, messy, and a little bit more chaotic, but I think this film struck a decent balance, and I was very, very curious to see how the next film would turn out. So here we are with The Bone Temple. It's out now, and I'm going to talk about it. So as per usual, I'll talk about the story, characters, and presentation. So without further ado, let's jump in. Okay, and now it's time to talk about the story, and it can be summed up as the following. Continuing from the events of the previous film, young Spike is inducted into Sir Jimmy Crystal's gang of strange misfits, and they continue their journey on the mainland. And as things progress, Spike starts to realize the severity of the situation that he is in. And on the other side of town, you have Dr. Kelson, who makes an interesting discovery that could change everything for the world. But that is a way for me to summarize the film without going into the area of spoilers. As I said before, I enjoyed this film quite a bit. While it is consistent with what came before in terms of its tone, characters, and certain plot elements, it also feels like the other half of the coin, with this film expanding upon the characters, their motivations, and seeing the more depraved and psychotic side of things as well. It's all about that sort of human element. What happens with the human race when they are in the midst of this infected disaster, and how can you survive? You get to see just a bit more of what's going on outside of that community you saw in the previous film. How there are certain unspoken rules that need to be followed, and how there's not only people that are out for themselves, but there are also people that are still trying to band together to weather this sort of crazy storm. And then on top of that, you have the Jimmies, who are just this very strange group of individuals who have had their minds sort of like messed up due to their leader, Sir Jimmy Crystal, basically creating this little mini cult. And they all have such interesting, funny at times, but also just crazy and horrific points of view, and how they choose to conduct themselves around others and themselves. It's just a mess. And without going into the area of spoilers again, because I just want you to see this film as cleanly as possible, there are just things that you see these characters doing where it's just like you're not quite sure how you'd be able to handle yourself in the situation, because things could go either way for you depending on what you said or what you did. But they were fascinating to watch. And I like the idea that, much like, certain other post-apocalyptic films, it's all about that human element, and it's about how the actions of the key characters not only affect themselves but also the others trying to survive. In some ways, this film is actually more brutal than the last one. When it comes to the violence in the previous film, it was pretty full on and in your face, but this one feels a little bit more intimate and just a little bit more grimy. And when you see how the violence is done to certain individuals, you're just like, oh god. But as stated before, there is some unexpected humor, and it's used at just the right times to bring a little levity or create some really fun moments. There is one sequence in particular involving one character which is just insane. And it was humorous, it was spectacular, it was wonderful. And when you see the film, you'll know exactly what I'm referring to. Alright, and now it's time to talk about the cast. They were all really good. Everybody put in a grand performance. And there are definitely some people that stood out. Firstly, starting out with Ralph Fiennes as Dr. Ian Kelson. Oh my god, he was fabulous. Ralph Fiennes has been one of those actors since the time that I remember seeing him for the first time. He's just been great, and there's not been a film where he's not put in a good performance for me personally. And in this film, he continues the performance that he gave before. There's a lot of consistency with his character, but we also get to dive into Kelson a lot more in terms of his day-to-day activities, what he ends up getting up to, and how he interacts with certain people. You get to just see a little bit more behind the curtain of him, and we see a side of him that we've not seen before, which is a little bit more interesting, let's just put it that way. But Fiennes was looking like he was having a damn good time with his role. And again, we get to see so many interesting and fun things, but Fiennes, absolutely spectacular. And the other really amazing performance comes from Jack O'Connell, who was super good as Sir Lord Jimmy Crystal. He is just as unhinged, strange, and hilarious as the previous film, but much like Kelson, we get to dive a lot more into this character, because obviously when he showed up at the end of the previous film, considering who he has modeled himself after, that dodgy Jimmy Savile geezer, I think for the UK lot of people, we understood like that there was a little bit of interesting context going on there. And I feel like this film dives into his mindset a little bit more, and you start to understand that he's not just this nutcase, but he's a nutcase with an idea, with plans. And while he is still a very complicated, strange, and unlikable character, you start to understand his mindset a little bit more, and understand why he's assembled this weird little group and why they're on their little quest. And O'Connell once again just proves that he is very captivating to watch on screen. From the big over the top elements of the character to the more subtle bits of his performance, O'Connell was just really good. And Alfie Williams as Spike, he was still pretty good. However, unlike the previous film where he had a lot of the heavy lifting to do as the core character that was spread across the film, I feel like his character was a little bit more reserved. And while he still had key parts to play in this film, he felt like he was a little bit more of a background character. And I felt like his character didn't have as much urgency as the previous film. And he still put in a good performance, don't get me wrong, but I just didn't find his character as compelling as what came before. And then you have Aaron Kellyman as Jimmy Inc. Kelly Moon is one of those actresses that I've seen about here and there, but she's slowly started to show up in more things over the last, I'd say, almost 8 years. The first thing I saw her in was the solo Star Wars film. Then she showed up in Falcon Winter Soldier, and now she's here. She gives a very subdued but interesting performance where her character, again, is a little bit more self-aware and is checking in with Spike. And there is a lot of stuff going on with her that you'll see once you see the film. But Kelly Moon puts in a good performance, and I found myself, liking her character as things went on. And then you had the other major performance would be Chai Lewis Perry, or is it Parry? I'm not too sure. I may have butchered that last name, but yeah, he is the Alpha, aka Samson, which was named by Kelson. And his performance was really good as well. While he's still this big hulk of a man running around screaming and causing chaos, there is some other things done with his character that made him a lot more interesting, and you see another side of the character that, again, I did not expect, but it was fascinating and very well done. And Parry did a good job with his performance, man. I quite liked it. And again, when it came to the presentation side of things, I thought that was also pretty solid. Again, we went with a slightly different style of filmmaking than the previous one. So the visual style, I guess you'd call it a little bit more traditional in terms of how it's structured. But again, there are some sequences in the film that are very well done when it came to the violence, how it was shot, and, the lighting and, camera work. It was all pretty sick. And then you have the film score that was done by Hilda G. I'm not going to attempt to say her last name, but I thought I recognized this name. And when I looked into it, I was like, oh yeah, she is the one that won the Oscar for the film score for Joker. And I remember that score being super eerie, creepy, and unsettling, which helped, enhance what was going on with that film. But I also remember that she did the film score for the second Sicario movie. But the film score for this one, it was good, but I would say not as memorable as what came with the previous film. In conclusion, I would say 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple is another solid entry in this series, which builds upon the foundation of the previous film, while also expanding upon numerous elements in interesting ways. If I had any issues with that, some nitpicks, I'd say this film sort of lacked the gritty edge of the last film in terms of its tone, the sort of British vibe, and some of the filmmaking style. But outside of that, I had a really good time. Again, I was quite captivated by the story, the performances were great, and again, there were certain things in this film which were just super fun that you just have to see it to believe it. And with this being another solid entry, I can't wait to see what happens with the next entry in this series whenever that eventually gets made and, releases. But I would like to hear your thoughts on the film in the comments section below, or hit me up on Twitter where I'm at Hypersonic55 or at FilmFocus55. Check us out on Instagram, and obviously when it comes to the podcast, you can find us where all podcasts can be found, whether you're talking about SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, all that good stuff. But yeah, I'm going to stop yapping for now. Thank you for listening as always, and until the next time, this is the Hypersonic 55 signing out. Peace.